Okay, so today we're diving into some really fascinating stuff happening on the global scene,
Yeah, some major shift.
particularly with the US, Russia, China, and Europe kind of all mixed up together.
Right.
And we've got some really interesting sources to work with here.
Absolutely.
We've got statements from a high-ranking Russian official, some recent news, and then also some really insightful analytical notes as well.
Yeah, you really pulled together a set of sources that really, I think, show that the world is changing right now in some pretty big ways.
Yeah, it's in flux.
So for our listener, the goal of this deep dive is to sort of look beyond just the day-to-day headlines, right? And really try to understand what's motivating all these countries. What are the sort of patterns we can see emerging as they interact with each other?
Right, and why it matters to us, right?
Exactly. And we know it can be confusing, trying to follow all these different pieces. So we're going to try to like point out what we think are the most important pieces and how they fit together for you.
Yeah, it's like a giant global puzzle. Okay, so let's jump right in with some really intriguing comments from Russia.
Yeah.
So Dmitriev,
Okay.
who has this really interesting dual role
Yeah, he does.
as both president of the Russian Direct Investment Fund and also special representative for foreign investment and economic cooperation.
Right. So he's wearing two hats there.
Yeah, he was in Washington just recently on April 4th,
Hmm.
and he made this statement that really raised some eyebrows, I think.
It did.
He said that American companies are, and I'm quoting here, very eager to return to Russia.
And I think the fact that he holds that dual role that you mentioned makes this statement even more interesting.
Yeah? Why is that?
Because he's not just like a government representative. He's really deeply involved in the financial and business world. So when he says American companies are eager to come back,
Mm-hmm.
it suggests that this isn't just like some wishful thinking,
Yeah.
It suggests that there might actually be some real interest. There's some opportunity for, U.S. business interest to kind of align with Russia. And maybe it's driven by what our sources called non-traditional security aspect.
Right, non-traditional security. That's an interesting term.
Yeah.
What kind of things fall into that category when we're talking about the U.S. and Russia?
So think beyond like the usual military and geopolitical rivalry.
Yeah.
Right. So in this case, non-traditional security, it could be shared concerns about, things like the stability of the global financial system or the impact of these trade policies. We're seeing especially the tariffs.
Oh, so economic stuff.
Exactly. Or even, a shared interest in making sure certain regions stay stable so that it doesn't disrupt the global economy.
Right.
So it's about areas where, their economic interests might temporarily overlap, even if their broader strategic goals are different.
I see. So they might cooperate on some things, even if they're competing on others?
Exactly.
Okay, so that brings us to this two mahjong tables analogy, which sounds very intriguing, but also a little bit cryptic.
Yeah, it's a good way to kind of visualize what's going on there.
So can you unpack that for us and how it relates to all this?
Okay, so imagine there are like two separate mahjong games happening at the same time, right?
Two tables?
Two tables, yeah. On one table you have the U.S. and Russia, maybe finding some common ground. Maybe it's transactional. Maybe it's just temporary on these non-traditional security issues we talked about.
Okay.
On the other table, you have China and Europe who, despite their own complexities, might be aligning on certain things, especially when it comes to how these U.S. tariff policies are impacting them.
Right.
So it's not necessarily like formal alliances forming overnight, but there are these areas where their interests are starting to overlap and, and they might start working together more. And all of this is happening, while the U.S. itself is becoming more and more divided internally, and that's having this like spillover effect on the rest of the world.
So the internal situation in the U.S. is really kind of a driving force in all this.
Oh, absolutely. The analysis suggests that the Trump administration might be looking at history for some guidance here. They're looking at what happened with Kosovo after the 2007 subprime crisis.
Kosovo.
Back then, the U.S. made some concessions to the EU, but they also did it in a way that made it harder for China, Europe, and Russia to work together.
Yeah.
You know?
So they're playing the long game.
Right. And the thinking seems to be that the Trump administration might be trying to do something similar now. Maybe offering Russia some benefits or concessions to try to drive a wedge between them and China.
Oh, so like undermining that China-Russia relationship.
Exactly. It's a very strategic way of thinking about things.
So is there a reason why the U.S. might be focusing on this kind of approach with Russia right now instead of just focusing on China or Europe?
Well, the analysis suggests there's a practical element to it. The Trump administration might think it's easier to make deals with Russia on specific issues than it is with China.
Oh, so it's easier to work with Russia.
Right? They see China's core interests as less flexible, less open to negotiation, especially on things that China considers really important.
Yeah, makes sense. So they're going for the low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
You could say that, and the source material even says that, China's very unlikely to make concessions to the U.S. on things that it sees as central to its sovereignty and its relationships with other countries.
Right, they're not going to compromise on their core principles.
Exactly.
Okay, so then how do these shifts in the consensus between Russia and the U.S. on places like Ukraine and the Middle East play into all of this?
Well, that's directly tied to the relationship between China and the U.S.
Okay.
because that relationship is so uncertain. Any agreements between Russia and the U.S. on these regional hotspots, they become inherently less stable.
I see. So it's all connected.
Right, everything's in flux. So those smaller agreements are more likely to change as the bigger players, adjust their positions.
Okay, and our sources make a pretty blunt observation here. They say that more than 2.5 months into the Trump administration.
Yeah, relationships with not just China, but also Russia and Europe are described as being kind of a mess.
Yeah, it's a very chaotic landscape.
Yeah, chaotic indeed. And this all seems connected to the next big thing, which is Trump's announcement on April 2nd about increasing tariffs on a bunch of countries,
Yeah.
especially China, and Dmitriev's visit to the U.S. happening right around the same time. That can't be a coincidence, can it?
No, I don't think so. The analysis suggests that a main goal of these tariffs is to create what they're calling a tariff anti-China alliance.
A tariff anti-China alliance.
Yeah, and the strategy seems to be using a combination of pressure, the tariffs themselves or the threat of tariffs, and then incentives like offering to reduce tariffs for countries that side with the U.S. against China.
So it's like a global pressure campaign using economic tools.
Precisely. And there are even some more speculative possibilities. The analysis suggests that these tariffs could be used as leverage in any future talks with China.
Oh, interesting. Maybe even like as a way to set up a high-level meeting, or in a more negative scenario, if the global economy starts to really struggle, the tariffs could be used to justify printing a lot of money.
Oh, wow.
And they could say, oh, we had to do this because of all these unfair trade practices.
So using the tariffs as a cover.
In a way, yeah. And we saw a pretty immediate reaction from China, too, right? They announced their own tariffs on all U.S. imports.
Oh, they hit back pretty hard.
And the source material mentions that U.S. stock index futures dropped sharply after that announcement.
Yeah, which shows just how sensitive things are right now.
Right. One move can have huge ripple effects throughout the whole global economy.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about another event that seems to tie into all of this, and that's Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's recent trip to Europe.
Oh.
So he went to Hungary on April 3rd, and it was his first trip to Europe since 2023.
Right.
And it's especially interesting because there's that ICC arrest warrant out for him.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
So how does this seemingly separate event connect with all the other stuff we've been talking about?
Well, this is where we see what our sources call the spillover effect of all the internal strife in the U.S.
Okay.
It's not just affecting U.S. relationships with other countries. It's impacting Western capital interests in Europe, too.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly? How does that spillover effect connect to Netanyahu going to Hungary?
So basically, all the division and uncertainty in U.S. politics, it's creating ripples across the world. The analysis suggests that some Western capital interests, maybe they're worried about changes in U.S. foreign policy, or maybe they're just looking for a safer place to invest.
Okay.
But they might be moving their assets to Europe.
Oh, interesting.
And that influx of capital can then align with certain interests in Europe and potentially create new tensions and contradictions within Europe itself.
Oh, so it's a good chain reaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they even mentioned the French far-right leader, Le Pen, as an example of how these internal dynamics are shifting in Europe.
Okay, so Netanyahu is facing his own pressures, both at home and internationally.
Right.
And he might be looking for support, showing that he has other options besides just relying on the U.S.
Exactly. It's like he's hedging his bets.
Yeah, and the source material says that if Netanyahu comes back to Israel without any problems, without getting arrested,
Right.
it could mean that certain major European powers, the ones that aren't aligned with what the source material calls Biden-Soros,
Okay.
they might still have open lines of communication with the Trump administration.
Yeah, so basically there are these different factions within both the U.S. and Europe.
Right.
And they have their own agendas, which sometimes conflict with each other. And for Russia, watching what happens with Netanyahu can give them valuable clues about what's going on behind the scenes in the West, you know?
Like who's talking to who and who's aligned with who.
Exactly. It helps them make their own strategic decisions.
So it's like a whole other level of complexity.
Absolutely.
And the analysis also says that Russia shouldn't completely write off Europe, even though there's tension between Europe and the U.S. right now, especially when it comes to Ukraine.
Right, because even though there are these open disagreements between Europe and the U.S., a complete break doesn't seem likely at this point.
Yeah.
So Russia needs to be careful not to push Europe away too much.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
And the fact that Netanyahu even made this trip to Hungary, shows how complicated things are within Israel, too.
Right, he's taking a big risk.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dig into the short-term assessment of Trump's tariff policy, because this is obviously a big deal with potentially huge global economic consequences.
Right. So this analysis is focused on what might happen in the first 3 months after these tariffs, especially the ones on China, are put in place.
Okay.
The first key point is that if Trump can keep these high tariffs on China for more than 6 months and the U.S. economy and financial system stay relatively stable,
Okay.
it could give him a boost for re-election, and help him achieve the goals of his family and his allies. But we have to remember that longer-term assessment we talked about earlier, which says that the current U.S. economic model has a limited lifespan,
Right.
So the short-term stability wouldn't change the long-term outlook.
So it's like a temporary fix?
Yeah, you could say that.
So a good economy could help Trump politically in the short term, but it doesn't change the bigger picture.
Right, the fundamental problems are still there.
Okay, what about the second point in the short-term assessment? What does that say?
So the second point is about how long the current U.S. economic model can actually last. And that's really uncertain. It could be anywhere from like a few months to 6 months. It all depends on how long these tariffs on China can be maintained without causing major problems.
I see, so it's all very fragile.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act.
Oh, and what about other countries besides China? What's the strategy there when it comes to these U.S. tariffs?
Well, the analysis says the strategy is to increase in order to decrease.
Yeah.
So for other countries, if they want to see those tariffs reduced, they're going to have to negotiate with the U.S. And the main condition for those negotiations seems to be joining that tariff anti-China alliance.
Right, so the U.S. is really trying to build up this coalition against China.
Exactly. It's a divide and conquer strategy.
So what happens if the U.S. can't keep those high tariffs in place, or if the negotiations with other countries don't work out?
Well, then the analysis suggests that Trump might go back to his face-changing tactics.
Right, he's known for that.
Yeah, he might suddenly change his policies or his rhetoric, depending on what's happening. And it's interesting because even though he talks tough on trade, he has actually tried to arrange meetings with China.
Oh, really?
But they haven't happened yet,
Huh.
which maybe suggests that he realizes he needs to talk to them, or maybe it shows that his position isn't as strong as he makes it seem.
So maybe he's bluffing a little bit?
Maybe.
Okay, and the analysis also points out that Mexico is left off the new tariff list, which is interesting.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
Well, what's the thinking there?
The analysis suggests that Mexico has become a really important transit point for Chinese goods coming into the U.S.
Oh, so it's like a back door.
Yeah, and if the U.S. put tariffs on Mexico, it could really mess up their own supply chains and hurt their own economy.
Oh, so they're trying to avoid shooting themselves in the foot.
Exactly. It's all very strategic.
It really is like a high-stakes game of chess, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, so to sum it all up, we've talked about this potential shift in how the U.S. is approaching Russia, this focus on non-traditional security concerns.
Right.
We've looked at Trump's tariff policies and how they're creating this global trade war, especially with China. And we've seen how the internal divisions in the U.S. are impacting the whole world, like with Netanyahu's trip to Europe.
Right. And what's amazing is how interconnected all these things are. The two mahjong tables analogy really helps us see how all these different relationships are playing out at the same time.
Yeah, it's like a giant web of interconnectedness.
Exactly. And it's all influenced by these economic pressures and geopolitical strategies and even domestic politics.
It's really mind-boggling when you think about it.
It is.
So it makes you wonder, how are all these threads going to come together? American companies maybe going back to Russia, the trade war with China,
Right.
leaders like Netanyahu making these risky moves.
Are we going to see new alliances form, or are we going to see new conflicts break out,
It's impossible to say for sure, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, the big question is, how do you think this is all going to play out? How will the global economy and these internal political pressures shape the world in the months to come?
Yeah, what seemingly unrelated events might actually be connected to these bigger shifts in the global balance of power.
It's a lot to think about, but it's fascinating stuff.
It really is.
So keep your eyes open and stay informed.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.